Why don't we get started? My name is Marty Barron. I'm the executive editor of the Washington Post, and we're really delighted that all of you came out this evening to the Post. We're happy to welcome you here. Tonight, you're going to get the chance to meet some of the journalists and the editors behind the Post's book, Trump Revealed, as you know. This was an exhaustively researched book about the life and the career of Donald Trump. The Post has a long tradition of delving deeply into the presidential nominees of each major party. And this year, given Donald Trump's, shall we say, novel and oversized presence in the political arena, there was an opportunity to do a book. And we were happy to seize that opportunity. And we're especially grateful to Scribner, which is over here, all these folks who just came in just on time for making that possible. I'm not going to mention all of them, but I do want to mention that we have publisher Nan Graham. Raise your hand, Nan. There we go. And we have editor-in-chief Colin Harrison here. Thank you for all you did. They worked incredibly fast and incredibly hard and with impressive skill throughout, and we're very grateful. From the Post, there were 24 journalists who worked on this book. They needed to both work quickly and to go very, very deep. And that's why we deployed such a large team. Scott Wilson, our national editor, who unfortunately could not be here this evening, assembled that team, drawing from throughout our newsroom, from every department in our newsroom. And all of this came together in a matter of months. This evening, you'll hear from 5 of the people who worked on this book, and with the co-authors were Michael Kranish, who was here, and Marc Fisher, right behind me, and I'll try to step away. They were the primary authors of Trump Revealed, but everyone, this entire team, contributed to it, and this represents a comprehensive examination of Donald Trump's life, his personality, his business dealings, and his long-running encounters with politicians and politics. We believe this is the kind of in-depth reporting that readers expect from the Post. And with that, it's a special pleasure for me to introduce tonight's moderator and one of the co-authors of the book, Trump Revealed, senior editor Marc Fisher.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you all for coming out. It's great to see such a big crowd, but I think I understand why so many of you are here. If there's one thing that Americans just can't seem to find enough of these days, it's information about Donald Trump. Well, but actually that's kind of true, because he is the first major party candidate in 60 years since Dwight Eisenhower who has not previously held elective office. And what that means is that he has not been vetted in the way that most politicians are as a matter of course as they run for various offices. So obviously he's had celebrity for decades, and celebrity is actually a very different kind of attention from having your life and career and background rigorously examined in the way that would help voters understand how you think, how you make decisions, and what you really believe in. As Michael and I have been making the rounds on TV and radio appearances in promotion of this book, we've found that the single most effective way to sell this book was one single tweet from a guy named Donald J. Trump, late of Jamaica Estates, New York. He, the night before the book was actually released, so he couldn't possibly have seen it, he put out a tweet saying, he calling the book a hit job and saying that it was boring and you shouldn't buy it. And of course, our numbers went soaring after that, so we're tremendously grateful to him since he informed 11 million of his closest friends about the book. But what was fascinating about that was that he obviously couldn't help himself. Any rational campaign advisor would have told him, just ignore the thing. But he couldn't help himself, and so he did this. And it was also, so this was confirmation of a major theme in the book, which is that this is a man who deeply believes that the proper response, the only proper response to anything that could be at all critical, is to attack, and to attack hard. And we trace in the book the derivation of that characteristic of Donald Trump, which traces not only to his childhood and having a father who taught him to be a killer and warned him against being a nothing, but also to his relationship with Roy Cohn, the infamous New York attorney who was kind of his mentor in his 20s when he was just starting out on his own in business. Marty mentioned the origins of this book, but I want to give you a little more on that before we get going with the discussion. This book came together in late March, so if you recall back to the primary season, it was really only around that time that it became very clear that Donald Trump was the likely nominee. And so at that point, this team of more than 20 reporters was put together. And the deal that we struck with Scribner, I think, was finally signed on a Thursday, and the plan was to announce this to the public the following Monday. So the next day, Friday, I called Hope Hicks, who was Donald Trump's press secretary, as a courtesy to let her know that this would be announced on the following Monday, and also to ask her, we wanted to have a series of interviews with Donald Trump. We wanted to get as much of his time as we could, because although we had this large team of reporters who would be digging into every aspect of Trump's life, looking at records and documents, talking to everyone from his friends and classmates and neighbors as he grew up, all the way through his business associates, partners, competitors, vendors, contractors, and so on. And we wanted as much time as we could get with him, so I explained the deal that we'd made and the book that we'd be doing and how a lot of reporters would be calling them. And before I could get the full explanation out, Hope Hicks cut me off and she said, "You are profiteering off Mr. Trump." Which was kind of curious, given that he spends a good chunk of his day talking to reporters, nearly all of them from profit-making institutions, or ideally profit-making institutions. And she was not open to that line of reasoning, and she cut off the conversation and said, "We will not be cooperating with this book. You're on your own." And so we had thought, well, that was a fairly likely outcome anyway, and that didn't really affect our plan for how to report out this book. But then, lo and behold, the following Monday, she called back and said that she had had a chance to, as she put it, tell Mr. Trump about your fabulous idea. and she said that he actually liked the idea and that he wanted us to come up to Trump Tower as often as we liked, for as long as we liked, because he wanted this book to be fair and accurate, and he wanted to get the real story out about his life. So one interesting curiosity there was that his own press secretary, who'd worked with him for a number of months, didn't realize that he would very much like the opportunity to talk about his favorite subject, himself. Indeed, as we talked to Trump in the weeks that followed, he regularly extended our interview time, doubled and tripled the amount of time that he spent with us. He took all questions. Some of them he answered in more detail than others, but he indeed had us back time and again. He spoke with a number of the reporters who are in the front row here tonight on the phone and in person as they went into greater depth on topics that they were digging into. We had people working on this book who were experts in reporting on Atlantic City, on finances, on casino gaming, on organized crime connections. We had people who looked into his brief experience as a sports franchise owner in the U.S. Football League, and so on, all through every chapter of his life. And one of our goals here, therefore, was that kind of completeness, and another was transparency. We know, and we document in the book, that Donald Trump is a highly litigious person. In fact, he has sued the author of a previous biography for $5 billion. And we asked him, Michael and I had a certain curiosity about that when we were talking with Trump, and so we asked him about that case, and he said that he'd actually never read the book. So I was kind of puzzled by that. I said, well, how do you go about suing somebody for $5 billion when you've actually never read the book? And he said, well, you could probably say this along with me. People told me it was a bad book. Classic Trumpism. And he didn't see anything untoward about that. And so he was alternately with us very gracious, very generous with his time, very open to answering questions, and yet every once in a while he would slip in a threat about how if it was a bad book, as he put it, he would come after us, and he would come after the Post. So there was this kind of alternating graciousness and tension through the whole relationship that we had with him. And this kind of binary approach where, it's either a good book or a bad book. This is something that's also shot through the book, shot through his life. One of the things that makes him decide whether a book or an article is good or bad is whether it questions the extent of his wealth. And this is we've several anecdotes in the book about his sensitivity to that question. When he sued Timothy O'Brien, the author of the other biography, Trump lost twice in that lawsuit, and what triggered the lawsuit was indeed a chapter questioning whether Donald Trump is as wealthy as he claims to be. And if you've been watching the campaign closely, you know that the number that he gives for his wealth varies a lot. He sometimes says $9 billion, $10 billion, $12 billion. And we don't have any way of giving you a definitive number of what he's really worth because he hasn't released his tax returns. But we do have ways of coming to the conclusion that he's probably not worth nearly as much as he says he is. In fact, a judge in that libel case came to exactly that conclusion in almost those exact words. And in fact, in a deposition in that case, which we have as part of the archive that backs up this book, Trump was asked directly, how do you come up with this number that you bandy about how much you're worth? And he said, quote, "It depends on how I feel on a given day." Now, there's actually something legitimate about that because his brand is his name. And his name is what gives value to many of his properties and other businesses. And so people decide to stay at a Trump hotel or go to a Trump golf course in part because of that name. So there's a clear value to it. And putting a number to that value is more an art than a science. But how he assesses himself is he takes the actual assessed value of properties that anyone can look up in the tax rolls, and he adds the value that he connects from his name, his reputation, and his brand. So he is a tricky figure to write about in that sense. In fact, when he was Comedy Central, the cable channel, was going to do a roast of Donald Trump some years back. And the directions went out to the comedians who were going to be roasting him that, unlike most of these roasts, his family is fair game. You can joke about his kids, you can joke about his background, any of that is totally fair. Only one thing the comedians were told they may not joke about, and that was the extent of his wealth. So, he's a tricky character to write about, but we did have this great team of folks who you're going to hear from tonight, and I want to turn it over to Michael Kranish, my co-writer, who will give you a couple of examples of the things that made Donald Trump what he is today.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody, for coming out here. It's a great honor to be part of this project. I don't know if the Post folks know this, but when I was a kid growing up in D.C., I was a Washington Post paperboy for about 5 years. So the ink is not quite worn off, and I'm thrilled to be here and working on this project. I want to tell you a story that explains, I think, why biography is so important in writing about a presidential candidate. We do fantastic stories, and biography is sort of the threads of all those stories that we try to put together. Because in the case of Donald Trump, you have a man who has never run for public office or held public office, so there's an awful lot that we don't know about him, even though he's one of the most covered figures of our generation. So if you look at a person's life, how they've dealt with crises, that to me is one of the most important things. Someone who has dealt with dark moments in their life, and certainly Donald Trump fits that category very, very well. So I want to take you to the morning of October 10th of 1989 in Atlantic City. It's a bright, sunny day. and 3 of Donald Trump's top casino executives. He's got 2 casinos at this moment, and he's about to open a 3rd, the Taj Mahal. And these 3 casino executives are about to take a helicopter ride to New York City to meet with Donald Trump and to promote a boxing match to be held at one of his casinos. And so the 3 men get on board a Sikorsky helicopter and take the flight to New York. They have a press conference at the Plaza Hotel in New York. They meet with Donald Trump at Trump Tower on the 26th floor. And the meeting goes a little bit long, and they can no longer take the Sikorsky back to Atlantic City, so they book another flight, a charter flight, and they take an Italian-made Augusta helicopter. And so they go to the heliport in New York City, they board the helicopter, and a few minutes into the flight, they're over the Garden State Parkway, and what they couldn't have known was that there was a small scratch on one of the rotor blades. And at 2,200 feet, that helicopter basically burst apart, and the 3 men and the 2 crew were both killed. And it is one of the most tragic days in Donald Trump's life, and certainly for the people who were killed in that tragedy. And for Donald Trump, I asked him about this. We had a separate interview where I talked to him extensively about this incident, and he does say, aside from the deaths of his parents and his brother, Fred Jr., that this was the most difficult day of his life, because these men were in charge of making sure that he would be successful. Donald Trump had built some buildings, of course, in New York City, Trump Tower, and he was taking a big gamble in Atlantic City. At that time, this was the only legal casino operation in the East Coast, and Donald Trump wanted to be the biggest and best operator. So he had 2 casinos, was about to open the 3rd, and suddenly the people who were in charge of that had perished. Donald Trump had not really focused himself on that business. In fact, at the time, he was having an affair with Marla Maples, and as he said in interviews for this book, that he had taken his eye off the ball. And then suddenly he had to look at what was going on, and he realized that he was in deep, deep trouble. So there was one person he got a phone call from shortly after the accident. That man's name was John O'Donnell. And O'Donnell was supposed to have been on the helicopter ride, but instead he was in Hawaii competing in an athletic event, and he'd sent a junior executive. O'Donnell now basically had all of this operation on his shoulders. And Donald Trump met with him when he came back from Hawaii, and he said, "Now it's your turn." And then he said, "Don't leave me." And O'Donnell later said that this was the first time he'd seen such fear and uncertainty in Donald Trump's eyes and in his voice. And long story short, because I want to give everybody a chance to talk and questions and so forth, what happened next was that things had gone so bad, Donald Trump had gone so deeply in debt, that there were great, great problems despite the public acclaim for the opening of the Taj Mahal. And pretty soon, all 3 casinos went into bankruptcy, and there were 3 other corporate bankruptcies, and a lot of people were fired. Donald Trump, in a fashion that we are familiar with now, said someone who was running the casino had a type C personality, and he blamed others. But as I mentioned, he also told us he'd taken his eye off the ball. So we tell the story in great detail in the book about how he managed to survive the nadir of his career in Atlantic City. And the fact that he did survive tells you something. He basically had to look out for himself, and as he told us, he said, "I was looking out for Donald Trump. I needed to survive, and that's what mattered at the moment." And he did survive. So with that story, you can understand how he reached some depths, and also why those who have underestimated him would do so at their peril. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to turn to some of the other reporters who worked on the book. Bob O'Hara is a reporter in the Post Investigations Unit, and he did some of the very difficult document work on this book, as well as finding some people who were willing to talk about that period that Michael was just talking about in Atlantic City, some very rough times for Donald Trump. And Bob, you learned a lot about Trump's business style and about the kinds of characters he was willing to associate himself with in order to get a start in the very rough and tumble of Atlantic City's casino world. Talk to us a little bit about that.
It's actually remarkable because it was a long time ago, but it feels very fresh and I think predictive in some ways about the type of personality that he is. Probably the most formidable character that he connected himself with was Roy Cohn. And if people don't remember Roy Cohn, he's worth looking into. He was the brains behind the McCarthy hearings in the 50s. And he was a brilliant, something of a prodigy as a young man, and was pretty much a savage legal mind who focused on attacking as much as possible and never apologizing. And he ran into Trump in early 70s, and Trump embraced him, and they became they developed an interesting relationship that was both legal and friendship. And Cohn sort of squired him around New York, introduced him to a lot of powerful people. And I think that that was probably set the tone for much of the rest of his career. Cohn represented him through the 80s, and there are qualities that we see in Donald Trump now, some of the harsher qualities that are remarkably similar to Roy Cohn's methods and demeanor.
And just briefly, tell us a little bit about assembling the documents that gave us insights into Trump's finances in that period.
Well, there's a massive trove of information, and we probably tapped a lot of it, but there's a lot of material to be examined. One of the things that we found is that Donald Trump has surrounded himself in complexity and kind of a cloud of obscurity throughout his career. Deals are complex, answers are complex and vague oftentimes. And the documents that we were able to compile, particularly from the Casino Control Commission in New Jersey, helped us to cut through the fog of obfuscation and to get to particulars. And the one that was most striking to me, and it was so striking I actually did not believe it for a while until I reported it thoroughly and realized it was true, was that when Donald Trump was trying to get his third casino, the Taj, he had to show that he was financially capable of managing himself and making it thrive. And he promised the regulators that he was not going to use junk bonds to finance the Taj. And in his testimony, which is in black and white, you can actually read it online, he says that people that use junk bonds are losers, in effect, and that they're stupid, and that companies that use junk bonds are, in effect, junk. And it was only, and they approved his move to go forward, and it was only a few months later that he could not raise the money at the low prime rates that he had promised and used junk bonds. And in making that decision and actually signing off on those junk bonds, he sealed his fate, and his whole empire was almost certain to go down the tubes, as was predicted by a financial analyst who was watching everything very closely. So that's the kind of detail that we were able to mine to get to the particulars rather than the generalities that had surrounded him and that he surrounded himself with.
Mary Jordan is a national reporter at the Post who led a group of reporters who looked into Donald Trump's family, his relationships with his wives, 3 wives, and his 5 children. And as part of that, we made an effort to talk to all of those people. Talk a little bit about what that was like and what came out of it.
So I got the women. And Karen Heller is here, another great reporter, and boy, was that interesting. Okay, there has never been a president who has 3 wives alive walking around. It's never happened, right? And where are they? We know everything. This guy is on the air all the time. Where is his first wife, Ivana, the famous one who is the one, in fact, she's from the former Czechoslovakia, who coined the term the Donald. The Donald, she used to refer to him. She's also the one, when they had a wicked, wicked public divorce, it was on cover every day of tabloids, said, "Don't get mad, get everything." Okay, this woman likes to talk, and she's just disappeared. We've never seen her. Second wife, she's still alive. She's been married 4 times, and Donald went to her 4th wedding. But Marla Maples comes along, and he's still married inconveniently to the first woman. And so this was hidden for a while, but then there was this big scene in Aspen at Christmas time, and the 2 women were fighting over Donald. He loved it. It was in the paper. At that time, he wasn't running for office, and he loved that women. He was on page 6 in the tabloids in New York. In fact, many, many people we talked to said he cultivated this. He loved being in the newspaper about this woman, and now along came, and that woman, and along came Marla Maples with a great name, former beauty pageant winner in Georgia. It wasn't even like Miss Georgia, it was like Miss Peach. But she was obviously very good looking and younger. And in the end, he got divorced from Ivana, married Marla, Where is she? She's gone. You don't see her at all during this campaign. She is around there. It is really stunning, especially, and the last thing, I just posted a story a couple hours ago today about his current wife, or I should say his third wife, because if you say current wife, sometimes people think there's more coming. but anyway, so his third wife, Melania Trump. She has not been heard of since the Republican National Convention on the 21st of July. We're in the home stretch of a presidential campaign where if he wins, she is the First Lady of the United States. She has an office in the White House, she has a public platform, and she is literally gone silent. It's very, very unusual, as many things in this campaign are unusual. Okay, so 3 wives, all of them are not talking while the kids are. But just if I could for a minute, let's go back, roll back, because it's a book on his life, about what it used to be about Donald and women. He used to go on Howard Stern, for instance. He was the shock jock. And he would go on all the time. And Stern would say, Donald, what do you think about Diane Sawyer? Would you do her? You know, and all this kind of talk. And they would go back, and it was much more graphic than that. And he was always talking about women. He was always talking about how Princess Diana got away from him. You know, if he only had a chance really to go, you know. But women defined him, and I think when we talk to people who know him, knew him in the 80s, the 90s, they said, you know what, there were a lot of rich people in New York. There were a lot of rich people who had buildings in New York, but there was only one Donald Trump who was always in the paper with some other babe who wanted him. And that was a direct quote from someone who knew him. So I think for a long time, women got attention for Donald Trump. And for some reason, I think he liked attention. And I think that he, when you go to his office, I've interviewed him in his office, and I've talked to Melania on the phone. It's very striking that there's only really good-looking women in the office. He talks about women's appearances nonstop. I mean, he's 70 years old, and I know a lot of older people often, you know, when they see somebody, they say it, but it's very unusual to have a presidential candidate, and he's getting tripped up on this every so often because appearances do matter. So in contrast to the old days where he just loved talking about Donald Trump and women, we don't hear from them anymore.
Mary had an especially revealing interview with Donald Trump's lawyer about this question of how Trump had spent years and years cultivating this playboy image and inviting reporters to come out and see him at a club when he would be there with the prettiest models, and yet his lawyer told you that when the cameras were turned off, it was actually a very different kind of dynamic.
Well, he would go to all the nightclub openings in Studio 54 in the day, you know, especially during this gap when he wasn't married. There was a time after Marla Maples and before Melania Naus that he wasn't married, and he blitzed the scene, but he was very careful about how he spent his time because it was where there were cameras, and he was always with models. He would call modeling agencies up, and in fact, when he had parties, make sure that his own parties had a ratio of 5 to 1, gorgeous women to men. And he was, you know, constantly surrounding himself with women and at openings. So I said to his lawyer, Jay Goldberg, I said, you know, how did he have time for this? He's always telling me that he's work is, you know, when he work, how could I do all this stuff, Mary? I mean, I'm working, I have all this money and responsibility, I have great buildings. Have you seen my great buildings? You know, this is how he talks. How could I possibly have been with all these women? And so I asked Jay Goldberg this, and he agreed completely. He said, actually, you know, he just likes, he's on the Trump Tower and he works in part of it. He really just likes to take the elevator up and turn on the tube and watch TV. And so I said this to Trump, and then Trump said, well, you know, maybe it wasn't as glamorous as it's all out to be. So, I mean, image, you know, he was great at getting attention. I mean, how many women did he really have, and how much TV did he have? I don't know.
Robert Samuels is a national political reporter at the Post, and Robert looked into the transition that Donald Trump made from celebrity to politician and the roots of his interest in running for office. And so tell us a little bit about, did he see this as a completely different kind of pursuit, or was it kind of a natural progression for him?
Right. Well, one of the governing questions that I was really interested in finding was, why is this man doing this? And it was very clear from speaking with people who knew him that at some point he didn't realize the phenomena and the movement that we've seen sweep across the country. What we know through his political life and affiliation is that he didn't really have much stomach for partisan principles. Between 1999 and 2012, he changed political parties 7 times. He's donated between 1995 and 2012, he donated $3.1 million by himself without looking at his companies to all sorts of politicians. He donated to Clinton, he donated to Carter, he loved Ronald Reagan. So what is this about, really? And to do that, we started looking at lots and lots of footage and interviews that he's done over the years. And we talked some people into showing us the unaired, unedited versions of these tapes. And early on, from his very first major network television interview in 1980, we see a theme that starts to emerge. He's talking about a building, and then he begins to rail on the idea that America is being laughed at, that there's something that's happening in the political system where leaders aren't strong enough like they used to be. And he begins to ponder whether or not politicians today can be like an Abraham Lincoln. And he says Abraham Lincoln could never win in 1980 because he was too ugly, he did not look good on TV, and he didn't know how to master the media. And the President of the United States in this modern era needs to know how to do these skills. And so what we see over the course of time is Donald Trump assessing politicians and presidents on their ability to affect messages, to communicate messages effectively, and to figure out whether or not they make the country feel great again. And everyone does a pretty okay job until Obama, who he considers a total disaster. By this point, in 2012, Donald Trump has mastered the celebrity that he said those great minds in 1980 did not master. He's become the star of The Apprentice. He has this Twitter following that everyone enjoys because he's talking about everything from whether or not Barack Obama's from the United States to whether or not Katy Perry's marriages are going to work out. And he decides that he is in fact the person who could best symbolize the greatness and tough leadership of America. And so there's been a lot of skepticism about whether or not Donald Trump wanted to do this, whether he wanted to run for president. But it is true that days after Romney lost that election, he was the one who filed an application to the patent office, and he copyrighted one phrase, and that phrase was, "Make America Great Again." And so you see the thematics of his campaign starting from early on in his public persona, but it had been something he had been thinking about and toying around with for several decades.
Great. There's one piece of video that you got from, it was an old Rona Barrett celebrity interview from the 1980s, which had never aired, or you got parts of it that had never aired, and he was remarkably similar in the way he talked about political issues, but he was also very frank about the sort of dynamic about what was making him decide to run or not to run. It was.
Right. It's interesting, and maybe it's because it was so early in Donald Trump's political career, but Rona Barrett really got probably the best information out of Donald Trump than any interview that I had seen, us notwithstanding. And you see him going through, he says, Rona Barrett asks, well, do you want to be president? And he goes, no, it's too mean of a life. I love building, I'm an artist, I love building my buildings. And over time, it really affects him. And he starts to take to this idea that, maybe one day I could be president, particularly because people continuously ask him whether or not he wants to be the president of the United States.
Yeah. And he shows up in polls through the decades again and again, not because he was running for anything, but because of his name recognition. People put him on polls, and he did very well. So it kind of built. Well, we want to turn it over to all of you to take your questions. So if you want to raise your hand, one of the folks with the microphones will come by and start with you, ma'am. Go ahead. Yep.
Could you discuss his personality? Was he warm? Did he look you in the eye? Was he reserved? Did you see him with Melania? A little bit about his personality.
Sure. In our interviews in Trump Tower, they were in his office on the 26th floor with this glorious view of Central Park and Fifth Avenue. And he was very courteous and was, as I said before, quite generous with his time. We never saw Melania. We did see his kids would wander in. Ivanka and Eric would wander in from time to time and talk with him about a business trip they were going on, or a problem at the property in Miami. But he's very soft-spoken in that setting. You get none of the bluster that you were familiar with from the rallies. And on the other hand, it is difficult to have a linear conversation with him. You can ask him about stuff, and he knows his field extraordinarily well. If you ask him about business deals he made in 1978, he will remember building materials and subcontractors' names and the whole process of working through a negotiation. But if you ask him anything that veers off of what he knows best, the knowledge base is very thin, and he tends to change the topic very quickly, a sentence or two, and he's off onto something else. And he has these sort of base topics that he goes back to when he's a little bit flustered about not knowing something, and so he'll just all of a sudden start talking about his TV ratings.
There was another thing that he would do is, I spoke to him only on the phone several times. If he was pressed on something, he would almost seem to get caught in a groove, and he would repeat the same thing over and over and over again. And sometimes one of my colleagues, Drew, was especially adept at this. He would sort of say, Mr. Trump, and kind of bring him back on course, and then we'd move on. But you're sort of joking aside, it was really a pronounced thing to be talking with someone who seemed to veer off and get caught in a groove.
He's a completely different person, I think, in person. He's really charming, he's very nice, he knows your name, he looks at you. I mean, everyone says that. It's not this bombastic guy that you see on TV. And everybody that's worked with him over the years say, I turn on the TV, I work with this guy for 20 years, turn on the TV, I don't know who this is.
This gentleman here? Yep.
I'm curious of the aspects of Trump's life and experiences that you researched. What of the challenges or situations were most analogous to the kinds of challenges a president faces? And what can we learn from those? I mean, your book has researched, and I'm looking forward to the chance to read it, how he dealt with women, how he dealt with celebrity, how he dealt with, and business deals, but this is clearly not a direct analogy to what a president would face. Right. And so what can we learn, what is most instructive in this, in understanding what he would be actually like as a president?
Michael?
Well, it's a great question, and the parallel is what he did running his businesses. And nearly all the businesses that he ran were private businesses, so they're difficult to examine until you go through ancillary sources like Casino Control Commission records, which Bob and other reporters did, for example. He did have 6 corporate bankruptcies. He has often said he had 4 corporate bankruptcies. This is instructive to understand how he sort of thinks, and clearly there were 6. And we asked him to explain, when you say 4, what do you mean? And he said, well, I think of the 3 casinos as 1 bankruptcy. In fact, there were 3 separate court actions for prepackaged bankruptcies, as they're called, and there clearly were 3 separate ones. But to him, it's 1. And part of it, he wants to put the best image out there. But the answer directly to your question is that he was told by his father, don't go deeply into debt. And as Bob O'Hara mentioned, he ended up going into junk bonds. He was hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars in debt. Time and again, he thought that he was not going to survive. We talked to a person who was basically given the job of negotiating with bondholders and banks, and that person told us that he was very concerned. This is someone who knew Donald Trump as well as anybody, and he was very concerned about Donald Trump at this moment. He said, I'm looking at him, it's bankruptcy after bankruptcy. He's in the midst of a huge divorce. He's being humiliated day after day in the front pages of the newspapers, and I worry that he might take his own life. It's a very striking statement for someone who actually feels affectionately about Donald Trump. And what he said was, but when I walked into the office of Donald Trump, there he was. His suit looked perfect. His tie was perfect as well. And he would say, what's next? What do we do next? And he had this ability, for whatever reason, to, instead of looking at, oh my gosh, there's all these terrible problems, to try to be thinking positively. One of his mentors was Norman Vincent Peale of The Power of Positive Thinking. Now that could either mean that he's detached from reality, if you look at it that way, or that he just is so positive oriented that he doesn't want to think about some of the deep problems he had. But the reality is that while he certainly says he's a great business person, that his businesses had trouble time and time again. Drew Harwell could talk more. He's here in the audience, a reporter who worked on this. But he had a public company at one point, one time only, because he had to raise a lot of capital. And that company did do well at first. It paid Donald Trump millions of dollars. It had the stock ticker of DJT for his initials. But the stock price went from something like $35 to 17 cents. And the shareholders were very angry. There were lawsuits filed that we write about. But the bottom line is that Trump was able to survive. It's another example of being at the absolute depths and finding a way for himself to survive. And this is instructive. This is, Donald Trump views it as, I am there. His words are, it's a one-man army. And he talked in one of his books about the power of narcissism, for example. He cited a book by that name. And he said it's a very powerful thing. If you want to be successful, you have to think in that sort of tunnel vision way, only about making sure that you do survive. And another one of his points in the book, Think Like a Billionaire, he advises that you have a, quote, short attention span, unquote. So either he sees that as an attribute, or he knows he has this particular disposition and he tries to put it in the most positive way. But examining that business career and seeing, as we try to do in the book, the peaks and the valleys and exactly how he's operated, it seems to be the best guide for how he might try to operate as a chief
One
executive.
huge question that comes up there is that he is the first president who has a lot of foreign holdings as people look at his foreign policy. He's expanding abroad. Kevin Sullivan, who's here, went to Azerbaijan. We had reporters in Moscow looking at his dealings. They're in Panama. And we've never had anybody who would be in the White House who has their global business empire. And so your good question is how would this work? Is he going to divest? And is it enough to divest himself? Is the Trump Organization with the kids? I mean, the value goes up of his holdings all around the world. And he is increasing his worldwide holding. It goes up if he's in the White House.
I mean, if you think about what do presidents do, they synthesize information and come to decisions. They persuade people of their positions, and they have a program of some kind. Well, Donald Trump is not someone who takes in information very deeply. We asked him about how he makes decisions, what he reads, and he says he doesn't read reports or briefings or anything like that. He doesn't like to read anything of any length. He believes that he comes to decisions by gut, by instinct. And so he very much wants people to come in and tell him about something orally, and he believes that he will get the nub of it in a matter of seconds. He's obviously very good at persuading people that he knows a way forward, but when it comes to persuading people individually in the way that the president has to form coalitions and achieve compromises, that's something that he's done very little of in his career. He talks about being a great negotiator, and we've certainly spoken to some of his business associates who credit him for that, but we've also spoken to a lot of people who've worked with him who say that he's all about getting his way, and he's not one to reach compromises. Yes, over here. Go ahead.
So it's the mic. Wait for the mic.
No, right here.
Yes, wonder, his strong anti-Mexican narrative in this campaign, which has pretty much defined the campaign, where does it come from? And did you have people in Mexico researching or looking into his deals there? Could it come from his frustration? Apparently he didn't do very well down there.
Well, I was the bureau chief in Mexico for 5 years with my husband, Kevin Sullivan, and we went to interview the last two presidents to talk about this, Vicente Fox and Felipe Calderón. As far as we can tell, and especially having been at rallies, it comes from a lot of people in America like what he has to say. And he knows that. He gets reinforced every day. It may be the most popular thing he says. There's no hint that he's always, not like Mexico or anything. His gift is that he is saying, this is what we keep hearing at rallies and talking to millions of Americans, they're fed up. And he says, and he'll tell you that in interviews too, is that he's a reflection of what people want. You know, he thinks that our immigration policies have been wrong.
To amplify that, I think one thing that's a safe bet with Donald Trump, although we can't be sure of it, is that he's actually the embodiment of a populist politician, and we've had a history of those going back 200 plus years, and they emerge periodically, and the patterns are very similar. They say what people want to hear. They try to appeal to people's anger and frustration, and it's possible that Donald Trump doesn't have any animus towards Mexicans, and that he's only playing the cards that he sees are out there for him to play with. And if that's the case, we should be troubled, because what we need to some degree in our leaders, I suppose, is a general sense if they're telling us what they really feel in the truth, and at least pursuing policies that are sort of generally in the interest of the country.
To add to what Bob's saying, I'd like to contrast his current position on Mexicans with what he said in the previous time when he was really close to running for president in 1999 and 2000. At that point, he was considering running as a third-party candidate against Pat Buchanan. Remember him? And Donald Trump said that the reason he'd be a better Reform Party candidate than Pat Buchanan was he was all about inclusiveness. And he did not like the way Pat Buchanan spoke about numbers of people, including Jews, blacks, gays, and Mexicans. What we're seeing now when you go to the rallies and you experience that, and he said it himself, is that when the crowd gets low, he loves to bring out the issue of who's going to build the wall, because the crowd goes nuts. It's a way to add something to the political perspective that people can understand and that they have a very visceral response about. And for him, that's very important. In fact, we spoke to a number of people who are talking to him about the decision to run for president. And when he talked about the issues that were really important to him, the relationship with Mexico didn't really come up. In fact, a number of them were surprised when he made the allusions to rapists and criminals crossing the border in the first speech.
One of the people who we spoke to who was closest to Trump gave us some guidance and said, when you're trying to understand his motives, always go first to the idea that he thinks of himself foremost as a showman. And he will always choose the most provocative line of attack because he wants to get the response, the affirmation from the crowd. Yes, sir, over here.
Yeah. I want to ask about something that's really important in a president, and that's his temper. I want to let you know that in the 80s and early 90s, I was in charge of promoting Atlantic City, so I have a little bit of knowledge about this. When Donald Trump saw an article in the Atlantic City press, or worse, an editorial, he pulled the newspaper off the newsstands in all of his hotels, and Atlantic City Magazine, which they also owned. If he didn't like what the Casino Association did, he stopped paying the dues, which was 25% of the budget. So I always think of him as petulant. And I was wondering if you found in your research anything that would give you some guidance as to what his temper will be like if he gets elected.
He says, and he's said it many times, that I can be a screamer, quote unquote. And I'm familiar with the anecdote that you're talking about in Atlantic City. And the person I referenced when I started talking this evening was John O'Donnell, who wrote a book called Trumped! And in that book, he repeatedly cites these temper issues and temperament issues. And in fact, O'Donnell got so frustrated with this temperament that he ended up quitting. And he sent him a note saying, I'm leaving. I asked Trump about this, and he said, no, Jack O'Donnell didn't quit, I fired him. So you go back and forth over this. But you do hear that from a number of people, and Trump himself has said that he is a screamer. Those are his own words. As to how that would reflect, Bob mentioned Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was the lawyer for Donald Trump when the U.S. government sued Donald Trump and his father, Fred Trump, for race bias in 1973. And Roy Cohn advised Donald Trump, when you're hit back 10 times harder or 100 times harder. And that, is the root of his personality to a great degree. He absorbed that lesson, actually settled that case eventually. But time and time again, we see cases where you have a lot of lawsuits, and he has imbued that philosophy in himself. And that case also gave him an animus towards the federal government.
He settled the case only after dragging it out and attacking viciously the prosecutors through Roy Cohn. And that's an aspect that he's more than a screamer. He is very open about wanting to punish people who, he often uses his phrase, viciously attack me. A lot of politicians want payback can come now or later, but so he fits into that mold.
And it's worth noting that a lot of Americans find this appealing. I think that there's a lot of people who think this guy, when he's hit, he says he's going to hit 10 times harder, and that's what he's going to do out there. They like his, confidence, and he is clearly feeding off of an enormous amount of Americans who like what they see on TV.
And that pugnacious attitude is something that we trace in the book all the way back to his childhood. And we have a number of examples of stories going back to elementary school of really kind of ruffian behavior, as he calls it. Yes, sir.
You guys are really amazing. Appreciation for you writing this book. I am going to present you both with a degree from Trump University.
Thank you.
And I'll get in touch with you, and I'll also get you a shirt of your size.
Okay.
My question is, which is very scary for me, is that after 2000, the press said they fell down on the job in not going after Bush's motives for going into Iraq. And it wasn't until a day or two ago I have seen the press begin to say, this isn't true. And not merely report on what he is saying, but some juxtaposition of it. He said this day, he said that day, and actually confront it. Because, I'm very scared about voters who, as you said, let their passions, they like what they hear. But my credo is, let's get the facts and argue about conclusions. What do you expect the press to do? What is the obligation of the press to hold him accountable? And I'm not necessarily talking about the Washington Post, but in general, to hold him accountable and say, you can't make these allegations when the facts belie it.
All right. Well, we've actually, I'd say everywhere we go, we get a question about this sense that many people have that there's been light or non-aggressive coverage of Donald Trump. We also get the same question about Hillary Clinton. I think the reporting that went into this book also fed more than 30 major stories that appeared in the Post over the last few months that go into great detail in pushing back against Trump's own narrative, own version of his life and successes and career. But you're right, there are other aspects of the news media that have not been as aggressive in doing the reporting that we think is our obligation in any presidential campaign or any campaign. I think particularly in television, there are real questions to be asked about giving over vast stretches of time to running his rallies and so on, greatly more time than was given to other candidates. But we can't control what they do. We decided that this was our obligation to do this deep reporting and commit enormous resources to this book and the stories that have appeared in the paper and will continue to appear in the Post.
I mean, the Post has been banned by Trump and he hates what we write. We have a fact checker full time. We've had all these big stories, but it is a key question. I think the debates and strong moderating in the upcoming debates is absolutely critical, because that's when everyone's watching, because people look at one story and then they call up, they'll see one story about Hillary Clinton and they'll say, why aren't you going after Donald Trump? And then they'll see one thing about Donald Trump and then why this? So the debates are a rare time. They're both there, and it's going to depend a lot on the moderators.
And on the Iraq War vote, just to be clear, he made the idea that it hasn't been talked about except the last couple of days. This has been written about for months by other organizations, by our organization. Many times the fact checker that Mary mentioned, I mean, they do extraordinary work where they check everything in almost real time. And there's a story up today that basically they went over again what Donald Trump said. He said that I was against the war from the beginning, but in fact, every fact check has shown that that's not the case, that he said on Howard Stern, that he didn't say he was against the war at that time. So every time that statement is made, the fact checker puts things out to say, no, that's not actually correct. So I think it's important.
All the way in the back? Yep.
Feelings with him. Do you think he means what he says, or is it all just part of the show?
It depends what he's saying.
It's hard to believe sometimes when talking to him that he actually means what he says.
I think it's also important to note that there's an accuracy question and there's an honesty question for people. And for many people who support Donald Trump, it's not so much the facts, but it's the genuine passion that he elicits when he's speaking. And I think that's a very important distinction to make, and it's an important distinction to acknowledge. The fact that he gets up there and he says something that aligns with people, it's an empowering feeling for those who feel that the Obama years have disenfranchised their ideas of how the country should operate and what a political leader should be. And one of the things that has been so important for his candidacy is that skill is one skill that Hillary Clinton has acknowledged that she really struggles with. And so I think, when we talk about this genuine question, I think a lot of voters are wondering whether or not the candidates are genuinely listening to them. And on that front, Donald Trump is.
Yes, ma'am.
I am impressed with how many of our institutions are being privatized. And I see this as potentially giving other people who have aspirations to enter into a power structure the chance. Are we looking to a day when we're going to profit from many of Trump's spawn in our political system?
I don't know where to start. I think I'm out there. I'm talking to voters a lot, and I think, in some senses, yes. I think people have been drawn. It seems so far ago, but 6 months ago, everyone was talking about Bernie Sanders and the impact that he was having on the Democratic Party and that process. And we're seeing a lot of different types of voices enter into the standard two-party system, and that will inevitably change who people pick and how they perform in terms of when they're trying to win votes.
Yes, sir.
The thing that I've been pondering is, building on this other question, a lot of people seem to say, well, this checks and balances, he's not really going to do what he says he's going to do. What reason do we really think, with the forces that he's unleashed and the legitimacy by the attention given to some of the racism and bigotry and things like that, that forces have been unleashed in our society that the checks and balances we think exist maybe won't exist? And I get really troubled, for instance, when you see former members of senior officers on both sides getting involved, and I wonder at what point do we become close to a banana republic? You know, at what point are we being too saying, well, he really doesn't mean it? Does it really matter if he doesn't really mean it, if he's really about power and the forces that he's unleashed become bigger than him, and you have like the SA out there, or you have...
I've heard this so many times that, you know, it's really just the presidency. I mean, and they're not kidding. They say, look at Washington. I mean, there's Congress, really not much gets done. It's the image. He's a strong guy, and number two, he's not the same old thing. So that's what they're electing, and for some amazing reason. So then we started writing a story about actually the president has a lot of power. I mean, it seems so obvious, but you're like, you could get us into a lot of trouble very quickly. And we should keep writing that, because that sentiment is out there. And even more than that, you'll talk to people and you'll say, well, you support the Muslim ban. But how would that work exactly? And then you start talking about the money and how it would work. And they go, well, you know, we don't think he's really going to do that, because it's just more like that he's going to be strong against it. And he'll be thinking about how he wants to keep that people out. And the same with the wall. You're like, wait a minute, it's 2,000 miles. How much money would that cost? And again, so he's getting this benefit because people want him to say it. They shout it at the rallies, and yet they're like, oh, we don't really expect he's going to build it. It's the sentiment. It's that he wants to. It's that he's telling us, I hear you, you're fed up with all the immigration, and a lot of people who think that NAFTA was bad took their jobs. So he's just better than his opponent, kind of connecting with people through TV. Maybe.
There's another aspect to your question, and it comes from the word unleashed. I've had this in the back of my mind for a long time before the election, but it's really come into play in the last several months, which is, I think what we're seeing now has been in play, has been developing and unfolding and unpacking itself for about 15 or 20 years, maybe 25 years. And the separation, the lack of comedy in Congress, ironically, with the rise of the internet, we've seen a surge, a deepening of anti-intellectual behavior. And I sort of feel like it's come into play, almost cresting now at this election. And to me, that's those are the undercurrents that are more troubling, because it's not who gets elected president necessarily, it's deeper trends in our society, which I suspect we'll be exploring after the election, because they're not going to go away immediately.
But I would just add one cautionary note, because there's an assumption often among Trump opponents that the rallies are these gatherings of extremists and racists and so on, and that's just not the case. There are crazies at his rallies, to be sure. They're extremists, but there are also a lot of, I did a story a few weeks ago about Obama-Trump voters, and there are a lot of them. And these are the hope and change voters, and these are people who saw in Barack Obama someone who heard exactly the kinds of things that Robert and Bob mentioned, and took that to heart and reflected what the frustrations and troubles that people were going through. And a lot of those same people see that in Donald Trump, and those are not extremists. So we have time for just one last question. Yes, ma'am.
And thinks about his own skills vis-a-vis those requirements.
He knows he's good at everything. I mean, that's what he would. I mean, he would say that. I mean, and people respond to his confidence. And he has said that he will get really smart people around him. And I mean, it's all about the confidence. And he has not. I mean, he has not said, you know, what is Aleppo yet.
But we did learn that he would have caught Osama bin Laden before 9/11 today.
Right.
I think the undercut of your question is a really important thing to explore. And throughout this country, I think there's a big debate over what is the requirement for a president, right? And for Donald Trump, he said what the requirement was 30 years ago, and he reiterated it 20 years ago. And that was a person who could reinvigorate the spirit of America, who has boldness and pomposity. Those are his words. And so does he think he fits the requirement? Absolutely. I mean, the question is a sort of values question on what the presidency should be. And that's where things get interesting.
One thing that's remarkable about Trump is that he's always had this very small circle of people he can really rely on. They're usually a couple of family members. With the casinos, there were 1 or 2 people, like I mentioned, who died in that helicopter crash. And time again, you see that there's 1 or 2 vital persons who can really tell him what to do. He does prefer having an acolyte. He doesn't like to be told that he's wrong. And so oftentimes you see people being fired. And you see it again in this campaign. He's gone through 2 campaign managers already. So that would be a big question for him. As president, he would have to tackle many, many issues that he doesn't know anything about. And would he rely on that advice? How would he organize that and synthesize that? So I think that's one of the big questions.
He talks about getting things done. The best way is an army of one. And it's very hard to run a country with just one person. And I would say that this is going to be a key thing in the debate, because Hillary Clinton has this, I mean, it's a polar opposite. She's had all this experience in government. And he is certainly going to answer this and say that he has the temperament, he's shown through his businesses, and he has the confidence to get the right people around him.
If he's right, he'll completely redefine what it means to be president, given his biography, his track record, his lack of experience in the public life. If he's right, he'll be the first person to come this far in an election. He is the first person to come this far in an election campaign. And if he's elected, he'll break all the molds.
And he has a ready answer for your question, which is when things go right, he was fully prepared, he knew what to do, and he takes all the credit. And when things go wrong, and we show this at various stages throughout his career, when things go wrong, the system is rigged. And we've heard these words from him in recent weeks, and that is exactly the phrase that he uses throughout his life when he's faced with troubles or failure. So when we hear that now, you can sort of see the gears moving, and he's not oblivious to his position in the polls, and so he's preparing himself and all of us for the message that he will have if he loses. So I think we have to leave it there, but thanks so much for coming out and supporting the book and supporting the Post. Jamaica Estates, New York. The night before the book was actually released, so he couldn't have possibly have seen it, he put out a tweet saying, calling the book a hit job and saying that it was boring and you shouldn't buy it. And of course, our numbers went soaring after that, so we're tremendously grateful to him since he informed 11 million of his closest friends about the book. But what was fascinating about that was that he obviously couldn't help himself. Any rational campaign advisor would have told him, just ignore the thing. But he couldn't help himself, and so he did this. And it was also, so this was confirmation of a major theme in the book, which is that this is a man who deeply believes that the proper response, the only proper response to anything that could be at all critical, is to attack, and to attack hard. And we trace in the book the derivation of that characteristic of Donald Trump, which traces not only to his childhood and having a father who taught him to be a killer and warned him against being a nothing, but also to his relationship with Roy Cohn, the infamous New York attorney who was kind of his mentor in his 20s when he was just starting out on his own in business. Marty mentioned the origins of this book, but I want to give you a little more on that before we get going with the discussion. This book came together in late March, so if you recall back to the primary season, it was really only around that time that it became very clear that Donald Trump was the likely nominee. And so at that point, this team of more than 20 reporters was put together. And the deal that we struck with Scribner, I think, was finally signed on a Thursday, and the plan was to announce this to the public the following Monday. So the next day, Friday, I called Hope Hicks, who was Donald Trump's press secretary, as a courtesy to let her know that this would be announced on the following Monday. And some of them he answered in more detail than others, but he indeed had us back time and again. He spoke with a number of the reporters who are in the front row here tonight, on the phone and in person, as they went into greater depth on topics that they were digging into. We had people working on this book who were experts in reporting on Atlantic City, on finances, on casino gaming, on organized crime connections. We had people who looked into his brief experience as a sports franchise owner in the U.S. Football League, and so on, all through every chapter of his life. And one of our goals here, therefore, was that kind of completeness, and another was transparency. We know, and we document in the book, that Donald Trump is a highly litigious person. In fact, he has sued the author of a previous biography for $5 billion. And we asked him, Michael and I had a certain curiosity about that when we were talking with Trump, and so we asked him about that case, and he said that he'd actually never read the book. So I was kind of puzzled by that. I said, well, how do you go about suing somebody for $5 billion when you've actually never read the book? And he said, well, you could probably say this along with me. People told me it was a bad book. Classic Trumpism. And he didn't see anything untoward about that. And so he was alternately with us very gracious, very generous with his time, very open to answering questions, and yet every once in a while he would slip in a threat about how if it was a bad book, as he put it, he would come after us, and he would come after the Post. So there was this kind of alternating graciousness and tension through the whole relationship that we had with him. And this kind of binary approach where, it's either a good book or a bad book. This is something that's also shot through the book, shot through his life.
Why don't we get started? My name is Marty Barron. I'm the executive editor of the Washington Post, and we're really delighted that all of you came out this evening to the Post. We're happy to welcome you here. Tonight, you're going to get the chance to meet some of the journalists and the editors behind the Post's book, Trump Revealed, as you know. This was an exhaustively researched book about the life and the career of Donald Trump. The Post has a long tradition of delving deeply into the presidential nominees of each major party. And this year, given Donald Trump's, shall we say, novel and oversized presence in the political arena, there was an opportunity to do a book. And we were happy to seize that opportunity. And we're especially grateful to Scribner, which is over here, all these folks who just came in just on time, for making that possible. I'm not going to mention all of them, but I do want to mention that we have publisher Nan Graham. Raise your hand, Nan. There we go. And we have editor-in-chief Colin Harrison here. Thank you for all you did. They worked incredibly fast and incredibly hard and with impressive skill throughout, and we're very grateful. From the Post, there were 24 journalists who worked on this book. They needed to both work quickly and to go very, very deep. And that's why we deployed such a large team. Scott Wilson, our national editor, who unfortunately could not be here this evening, assembled that team. Drawing from...
Also to ask her, we wanted to have a series of interviews with Donald Trump. We wanted to get as much of his time as we could, because although we had this large team of reporters who would be digging into every aspect of Trump's life, looking at records and documents, talking to everyone from his friends and classmates and neighbors as he grew up, all the way through his business associates, partners, competitors, vendors, contractors, and so on. And we wanted as much time as we could get with him, so I explained the deal that we'd made and the book that we'd be doing and how a lot of reporters would be calling them. And before I could get the full explanation out, Hope Hicks cut me off and she said, "You are profiteering off Mr. Trump." Which was kind of curious, given that he spends a good chunk of his day talking to reporters, nearly all of them from profit-making institutions, or ideally profit-making institutions. And she was not open to that line of reasoning, and she cut off the conversation and said, "We will not be cooperating with this book. You're on your own." And so we had thought, well, that was a fairly likely outcome anyway, and that didn't really affect our plan for how to report out this book. But then, lo and behold, the following Monday, she called back and said that she had had a chance to, as she put it, tell Mr. Trump about your fabulous idea. And she said that he actually liked the idea and that he wanted us to come up to Trump Tower as often as we liked, for as long as we liked, because he wanted this book to be fair and accurate, and he wanted to get the real story out about his life. So one interesting curiosity there was that his own press secretary, who'd worked with him for a number of months, didn't realize that he would very much like the opportunity to talk about his favorite subject, himself. But indeed, as we talked to Trump in the weeks that followed, he regularly extended our interview time, doubled and tripled the amount of time that he spent with us. He took all questions.
Throughout our newsroom, from every department in our newsroom. And all of this came together in a matter of months. This evening you'll hear from 5 of the people who worked on this book. And, you know, with the co-authors were Michael Kranish, who is here, and Marc Fisher, right behind me, and I'll try to step away. They were the primary authors of Trump Revealed, but everyone, this entire team, contributed to it. And this represents a comprehensive examination of Donald Trump's life, his personality, his business dealings, and his long-running encounters with politicians and politics. We believe this is the kind of in-depth reporting that readers expect from the Post. And with that, it's a special pleasure for me to introduce tonight's moderator and one of the co-authors of the book, Trump Revealed, senior editor Marc Fisher.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you all for coming out. It's great to see such a big crowd, but I think I understand why so many of you are here. If there's one thing that Americans just can't seem to find enough of these days, it's information about Donald Trump. Well, but actually that's kind of true, because he is the first major party candidate in 60 years since Dwight Eisenhower who has not previously held elective office. And what that means is that he has not been vetted in the way that most politicians are as a matter of course as they run for various offices. So obviously he's had celebrity for decades, and celebrity is actually a very different kind of attention from having your life and career and background rigorously examined in the way that would help voters understand how you think, how you make decisions, and what you really believe in. As Michael and I have been making the rounds on TV and radio appearances in promotion of this book, we've found that the single most effective way to sell this book was one single tweet from a guy named Donald J. Trump, late